Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast today a writer that I'm not only privileged to call my friend, but someone whom I admire enormously. There are many Australian writers out there producing quality book after quality book each and every year, satisfying the voracious demands of their eager fans. And Penelope Janu definitely falls into that category. And if you haven't heard of Penelope's work as yet, then dear listeners, you're in for a treat. Penelope is a former lawyer, a long-time legal academic whose debut novel, In at the Deep End, was published by HarperCollins in 2017. In the time since, Penelope has gone on to publish another 8 novels and 3 novellas. In 2019, Penelope's novel On the Right Track won the Romance Writers of Australia Romantic Book of the Year award in the contemporary romance category, a stellar achievement. And as someone who's read every one of Penelope's books, I can honestly say each book is better than the last, and is it any wonder her novels constitute auto-buys for many readers? Now, late last year, Penelope's new novel, The Summerfield Saddler, was published by HQ Fiction, and listeners, I think this is one of my most favourite yet, an absolutely terrific read. It kept me company on a long international flight recently, and I was so sad to have finished it, I kept going back and rereading different chapters. With an array of interesting issues to consider, a wonderful cast of supporting characters, evocative setting, and a handsome Viking at the centre of all the action, The Summerfield Saddler is a heartwarming story with a sizzling, slow-burn romance at its core that will leave you wanting more. So to say I'm delighted to chat with Penelope today is an understatement. Welcome back to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It's gorgeous to be here.
It's been a little bit longer than I realised that we chatted for the podcast. I think it's been about 5 years, and for that I'm a little embarrassed. But in that time, you published another 10 stories, a mix of full-length novels as well as novellas. So I wanted to ask you, Penelope, how do you manage it? What is the secret to producing a book a year?
I was still working part-time with the first couple of books, like we all do, writing madly in the wee hours and working in another job. For the last number of years, I have been writing full-time, and it is a full-time job. Some people are faster writers, and you'd think I'd be better at it after been doing it for a long time, but I'm still a slow writer, as I always was, I think, and I have to get things right. So it is very much a full-time job. So I mean, luckily it's obviously not a desk job where you work from 8 till 5. So there is flexibility, particularly near a deadline. It will be 7 days a week. Like editing, I can work really, really long days and nights, but the actual creative process when creating the characters and writing the story itself, I probably can only write for a few hours in the morning, and then I sort of edit in the afternoon. Yeah, I just do it consistently, I suppose, as much as I can. I mean, I enjoy it, but there is also sort of some marketing and things like that. And I must say, I do what I need to do in that space, but for me, I like to write. That's what I know. That's what I really enjoy. And that's what I've had some success in. So I can't do too many other things as well as write.
Fair enough too. And so how long do you think it takes you to write a first draft of a novel?
It is close to 9 or 10 months. I write neatly and tidily, but that's doing pretty much full time. I suppose it extends to 12 months where I basically have one published, and then I'm submitting the other one with them at 12 or 14 months of that. So I really start writing the next one. The last one's gone off. So there obviously are, structural and copy edits for the one that's going to come out the following year. So it's interrupted by those things. So I do set the work in progress aside for 6 weeks or so while I'm doing, say, a structural edit, because I really have to get myself back into that last book. Summerfield Saddler, in some ways, it was probably more a difficult book to write. There was, combined with a move, combined with I look after my grandchildren, I good all my family. So there's sort of a bit of that going on, and also the story itself, because the story is sort of loosely, well, certainly the character of Gordon Henry, the grandfather, is very much based on my interpretation anyway of Peter Allen's song Tenterfield Saddler. And I sort of have told that story in a very different way, but I really, I love writing that character of Gordon Henry, the man who sat on his veranda and made his saddles, and no one had a bad word to say about him. So he was really the starting point in some ways for that story. But then also in that Summerfield Saddler song, of course, is the death of the father, and then there's a third generation, and my third generation character is Mackenzie Henry, who's also a saddler. But there was that issue of sort of solving what did actually happen to the father. So I kind of had that more that crimey kind of, crime, I don't know what, mystery element too. And so maybe that made it a more challenging book. I spent a long time on it in edits.
For me, The Summerfield Saddler was a particularly memorable read, and I'm not just saying that because there's a character in there named for me, but because of the way that you manage the romantic aspects of your story with other elements. Penelope, in the past, I've described your writing as the perfect mix of sexy and smart, and I still stand by that. And so I wanted to ask you, is this something that you work hard to develop or maintain in your writing?
I don't know that I do it consciously, sexy and smart. I suppose what really makes me interested, I mean, some people say that, you write what you know. I'm much more of the camp, I suppose, that says, write what you'd like to know about, because that really interests me. And so often it will be something that I really want to know more about, whether it's how to be a saddler, leatherwork, that sort of thing. Certainly with the environment, there's always so much to learn. And Kit Thorson is a scientist. He works in Antarctica, and that's a really fascinating element for me as well. So the smart part in some ways probably comes from so much research, as you'll know too, that goes into every novel, but not all of it makes it into the book, or it'll be a very dry read with a lot of footnotes. But I think that does inform what happens. And then certainly with the personalities of my characters, the reasons why Ian Mackenzie is a saddler, obviously inspired by her grandfather, but also circumstances, a lot of problems in her childhood, which means that she tends to live quite a relatively small life. And so Kit Thorson was the absolute opposite to that, particularly in this book, because he's an internationally known documentary maker and he lives a very big life. And so then it was that issue of bringing these two characters together. And as far as the romance between them goes, though, I think it was a matter of finding, and by the end of the story, that there are these certain things that they see in each other that nobody else has seen. And that was the essence of it. And I guess in the writing of the novel, it can take some time, but you find that real thing, that why, how are these two very different characters work out that they're right together? And that kind of takes, I think this book is about 110,000 words. It takes that long. Slow burn, but then for me, I think with these characters, I always need that period of 6, 8, 10 months for them to actually know each other. And it might be intermittent when they actually get together, but I think at the end of that period, then you can really say that, well, in my mind, and hopefully in the reader's mind as well, that yes, you can see them together in another 10 years or, long term, that they do get on well together.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so you did describe a little bit about where you got the inspiration to write the Summerfield Saddler, the famous Peter Allen song, the Tenterfield Saddler, and about Gordon Henry. And as you say, Mackenzie or Mac is the saddler of Summerfield. She's taken over the business from her grandfather, Gordon, who, in this book has fallen ill. She's a wonderful mix of strength and vulnerability. She's determined to be independent, to carry on her work, and to be there for her grandfather. But she's holding on to deep trauma, isn't she?
Yeah, well, she certainly is. She has, she's lost her father, and she adored her father, and they shared a lot of things in common, that he was a creative and he was a filmmaker, but he couldn't pursue that passion really because as a result of her birth, and he wanted to care for her. And so there were custody battles and all sorts of conflicts with her mother. Her mother is a very, very well-known actress. And so I had fun with that too, because her mother is, quite an interesting character and a very different character from Mackenzie. But certainly all of those things meant that Mackenzie went through an awful lot as a child and as an adolescent. And so then she sort of found her safe place in Summerfield. But she has the capacity, and I think she has the real drive and need probably to live a bigger life in some ways. And part of that is through her own creativity. And that's how she ends up meeting Kit Thorson originally on a film set, because then she's been designing and making weaponry for a fantasy movie, which I enjoyed too. I spoke to my son a lot. Lots of things, fantasy. I thought, fantasy, how does it all work? And that was really fascinating. He gave me some fantastic insights. Even the mother has very narcissistic tendencies. And for some stage, I think I was asking my son about, he's an adult son, about fantasy and so on. Yeah, I just said, "Oh, and how would you define a narcissist?" And he related it to how things happen in games like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. And it's the person who's the one, the only one, and everybody else has to revolve around them. And that is kind of a well-known character in that sort of genre, and certainly in gaming and all sorts of things. So
That's how she became a designer for a fantasy film in effect.
yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she's holding on to deep trauma, and this is something that many of your characters from your other books also have, and I find this aspect of your storytelling so fascinating. Penny, how do you uncover those character traits for your protagonists? Do you workshop these traits in advance of writing, or do they just come to you as you go?
I research things as I'm actually writing. So some event might happen, the loss of Mackenzie's father, for example, and a very messy separation between her parents, and the impact of that. Through my professional life and areas I've worked in and researched and so on. I know little bits, like we all do. Getting older has its benefits about lots of things. So it is delving deeper into those particular aspects and what might make a character, I suppose, behave in a certain way. I have a few lovely friends who I can turn to and really ask, the more clinical medical questions about things, and I always do, to check that that's all good on that side. But in the writing, it's often it's showing how the characters behave rather than explaining it medically, and making sure that their responses and so on do make sense. And obviously, as the story progresses, invariably, there is more insight from the character themselves as to why they've behaved in a certain way, why they've been reluctant to trust, why they've pushed away, why perhaps they found somebody who they can rely on and they can move on in that particular way. So it kind of comes out naturally, and it probably comes out because I write from the woman's point of view and in first person as she's learning things herself. That's kind of the right time to really have that understanding. It is a gradual understanding, and yeah, we kind of walk that path together, I suppose. That sounds a bit odd, but as a writer writing a character, you're sort of working it out together with the character.
And I felt that with Mackenzie, or Mac, she was determined to protect her heart at all costs throughout this novel. She wasn't gonna let anybody in, and particularly not Kip. So when he comes along the scene, this Norwegian Viking, this famous filmmaker and conservationist, when he enters the scene, she's absolutely determined not to fall in love with him, and she finds every excuse not to admit her feelings to him and to herself. How do you maintain that sort of level of tension right throughout the story? Because don't you just want them to get together?
The thing is, if they did get together, well, one, I think it wouldn't work well in terms of how the characters are in my mind, because she wouldn't be ready to commit. And so it was too early. It just wouldn't work out. She has so many things to work through first beforehand. Also, to me, if they get together, then the story's over. It would be a very short story. It would be just like however long they got together, because then that would be it for me, because I do like that tension and that the difficulties that they have to get through. And in this story, I did really enjoy, and I didn't know that at all at the beginning of the story. Probably, what is it, about a third of the way through, when they go on an extended hike. It's a kind of a trial for her to see whether she could be the front person in one of the primary people in the documentary that she's going to be involved with. And so they're on a hike. They're staying in tents, and she hears him. He's outside at is it midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning or something? And why is he outside? That's because he doesn't sleep. Why doesn't he sleep? And it was only at that point that I worked out, he was there when his mother had a terrible accident, and that is his trauma, and that is that he has problems in sleeping, and he and manifests that in certain ways. Now, she doesn't know that yet, but I knew that then. And so then further on in the book, there's quite a pivotal scene, a few scenes really, where she works out what's going on with him. And that is something that he suddenly has a vulnerability. And she didn't see any of that at all at first, whereas she actually sees that vulnerability, and that's a chink, and that's sort of a way, not that he'd do it deliberately, but that is a way for her to see past everything else that everybody else in the world sees about him.
This is what I love about your storytelling and about contemporary romance in many ways. So in your story, both Mac and Kit are vulnerable. They're both suffering real trauma as a result of things in their past. I'm wondering if is it easier for you to write about male vulnerability now than it might have been, say, 10 or 20 years ago?
Often the characters I've written on the surface, many of the men seem to be in more powerful positions, I suppose, that they might be a couple of years older. They have certain jobs or careers. That means they're financially secure. We only really get to discover them through the woman's point of view, and that is a challenge. And that is something that I do kind of differently from a lot of romance, really, that I don't provide both characters' points of view. Thinking about it, I probably would only have to have half the scenes I create because then we can see them from different points of view. But I think that means it's a slow reveal in that way, I suppose, as to what the male's trauma is. But I think the reality of, and too, as mothers of daughters and sons, and, the good thing is that I think boys, adolescents, are supported more in those difficult times now, perhaps in real life, in many families, but in many families they aren't, just like women aren't, just like women are still going through traumatic situations. I mean, both parties can be. And unkind as it seems, they're often, it's their stories I tell. Well, not unkind, but I really like the aspect in romance in that even though they've been through many difficult times, they can come out at the end of it. And I suppose in that way, as far as readers go, that there's a possibility that they can come out of it at the end of some difficulty as well. And in a way, I guess, and on the page with romance as it's written now, certainly, I mean, sort of respect, honesty, trust, consent issues are always just so important. And so while there's intimacy between the characters, it's always done in a way that I would hope should mirror how it should happen in real life in terms of those particular aspects of intimacy.
And Kit is another in a long line of Nordic heroes who appear in your books. Not that I'm complaining, but what's the fascination for you?
Oh, yeah, so he's another Norwegian, and he has two brothers, which is a bit of a worry, but I'm writing one of the brothers' stories now. I think originally it was just a bit random, actually. Lars, so on the same page, that was my true romantic comedy, and he was called Lars. And then that sort of a Norwegian name. And then I was actually looking up, I think I'd written about, this was my first book, and I'd written about 200,000 words, which is way too many. It went to an editor and she said, "Oh, well, you've got to cut it back. And by the way, Lars doesn't even have a surname." And so I sort of looked up Norwegian surnames and Amundsen came up. So I called him Lars Amundsen in that particular book. Then Amundsen, of course, was one of the first men, or was the first man to reach the South Pole. And so Amundsen. So then I had the character in the Deep End who was an Amundsen, and he had a twin brother who was another Amundsen. That's another couple of Norwegians. There was that aspect, I suppose, which is a weird, just a quirky thing. But then also Norway's a country, yes, smaller population than Australia, but it's on the other side of the world. And writing characters from other countries, and I've also written two Scotsmen actually and an Englishman as a hero, because I have a lot of environmental I talk about the environment a lot in my stories in terms of climate and so on. That's a worldwide issue. That's a worldwide problem. And so in many ways, having a character from another country with a different perspective, or with an international sort of perspective, because of course in Europe it's all international because of all those borders. In Australia it's so much more isolated. That does provide a good way, I think, to show things like the environment in an international way, because it is that sort of an issue. And also Norway is a beautiful country, as you know, and have Norwegian friends and family and things like that. So.
Talking about the environment, Summerfield is a fictional Australian town, but it's representative of towns across Australia that are reliant on industries that are no longer economically or environmentally sustainable. And in this case, it's the closure of the Summerfield open cut mine and the impact that it has on the local community as a result. So tell me a little bit more about this and why you wanted to explore this issue in this novel.
I wanted to do that for a few books, actually, as far as, the mining industry and closing of mines, because it's often seen a bit black and white. You see, people say, "Oh, no, kick the mine here," and then you have the other side that's saying, "No, all mining is bad," and so on. The trouble is that many communities are built, and for generations they've been built on the mining industry, and it's who they are, and they're proud of it, and they're hardworking people, and it's a generational thing. So while, so much mining now is not sustainable, I suppose it was showing the difficult side of that for those communities. How does that community rebuild? And also the people in that community, they're not bad people necessarily at all. They just, that's what they've known. That's their jobs, their occupations, and that's what their dads did and their grandfathers did and their grandmothers and mothers supported um, that industry. And also, of course, it does lead to, the end of various towns, and that's just a reality. It was interesting, and I really like exploring, what can happen when a mine closes. Are there other ways? And I sort of can only really touch on it in this book, really, but things like water and damming rivers for certain reasons can lead to loss of wetlands. And so then, that's another environmental consequence. And wetlands with starting from scratch, I think I wrote all about the wetlands in that way. So, but looking at it through community members, I guess, with different perspectives, it just gave a good insight and hopefully a fair and more balanced view, I guess, as to, the sadness in some communities when they are losing their major industry, but then hopefully pressing for more support for those communities to create alternative industries and livelihoods and to enable those towns to keep flourishing.
I think you dealt with this really sensitively in showing both sides of the issue and showing how the closure of the mine did actually divide the town and how the town could potentially have hope and survive the issue. But given that Summerfield was fictional, I wondered, was it difficult to dream up a scenario to address the issues that you wanted? So, you talked about damming and the loss of the wetlands. Was it difficult to imagine a scenario in your mind how that could all work together?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, well, in a novel to make it kind of interesting, and it had to be over like a period of time, which is a bit tricky in the edits because it's not like you can't just make a decision, close the mine, and then, within a month or two, you've got a documentary team coming in to have a look at what they're doing to rehabilitate the land. It doesn't work like that. I mean, you can't restore land that's been damaged by mining. You can rehabilitate, and that's really complex. So it was sort of a few years after the mine had closed. There had been a lot of agitation for government funding, and that came in at that time. My engineer son-in-law was very useful as far as the dam and what can happen with that the river can be dammed, but then the dam can be open to an extent, and then that will allow for the landscape to come good. But that takes, it takes months and years of scientific reports and things to work out actually how to do that, and that's a reality too. So I was kind of careful in the way I put it all together, that it wasn't just going to happen overnight, because these things don't happen overnight. But on the other hand, hopefully providing a sort of a positive long-term outcome for the town, and that town would take years before all this happened. But in the meantime, the town could continue to operate as a result of the work that would be happening there.
Can you tell me a little bit about the research that you did to bring this issue alive on the page?
Yeah, well, just a lot of reading about, and there's sort of in New South Wales, as in other states, there are closures of mines, obviously, alternative energy, but then there's issue with the alternative energies as well. So, yeah, a lot of reading. And I did have an interest in this sort of in my academic days even. And so I drew on that. But I mean, the nice thing about writing fiction is that, so I don't want to scare readers off thinking it was an engineering journal, really on what happens. But often one of the characters, or both of them sometimes, they don't know much about what's gone on in the past. So I think it is a really nice way to explore in everyday language we all understand, these sorts of things happen. This is how you go about it. Things aren't easy, but with commitment, there can be success in that way. So, there was, research into the mine aspect. There's always research into the trauma aspect. There is a lot that goes into my books, like all of our books, whether it's romance, whether it's crime, whatever it is. It's always a challenge. I don't really look at Goodreads reviews, but I was looking for nice quotes, and there are lots of nice quotes. But a reviewer said, so she didn't mind the book, but she just basically had a very short quote and said, "This book was a struggle." And I actually didn't mind it too much, because I thought, there are my words. This book was a struggle.
When you and I have talked before about the fact that romance writing often get a bad rap, but all of your novels, like so many other romance novels out there, explore topical and serious issues, as we've just, talked about earlier. Your female protagonists are not helpless or submissive characters, quite the opposite, in fact. A lot of your characters are intelligent, socially and culturally insightful. We get snapshots of modern life and environmental issues in your books, environment, climate change, challenges of rural living, trauma, grief, etc., that just happen to have a central love story. So my question to you is, do you think or hope that your work contributes to a growing awareness around the versatility of romance writing?
Yes, I hope so. Yes, look, I think it does in its own way, with romance books. There's more people are being drawn to romance books. I think women, it's fantastic in that they read romance on a train without being embarrassed, that there's, romance, it's a clearly a romance book, which is wonderful. And so that's the next generation growing up, which is very different when I was young. There's no way as a teenager I would have ever had a romance book in my bag, or not that anybody could see it, because then consequences of that would have been really hard, and that you would have been picked on and bullied and whatever, that, you love romance. It wasn't a cool thing at all. So that's really positive. And I do think as well that, with the people who read my books that, and often I get comments or statements saying, I'm not a romance reader, but I really enjoyed this book. I say, yes, that's a new reader, because romance isn't just what often people portray it as, and often how it's still portrayed in the media as, it's just light, fluffy stuff. And it's not any more than, crime is, who committed the crime, or, his historical fiction is looking back into history and reimagining it. It's just, they're obviously different genres, but there's no reason that somebody, cannot read romance, even though they haven't read it in the past, and they'd probably be very pleasantly surprised in a lot of romances being published today.
Here, I absolutely believe that romance, in many ways, is the cutting edge genre for modern times, and it's wonderful to see so many new readers to this genre as well.
Yes, yeah, and in difficult times, I mean, there is an uplifting ending. You can count on that. That doesn't mean that it's not important. That can mean that it's extraordinarily important, because a lot of people need that at certain times in their lives. So I think that makes it, more important rather than less important. The fact that you can pick up that book, there can be all sorts of things in a romance novel, but at the end of that story, you sort of have that reassurance that your heart will be beating fast in a really good way at the end of it, as a result of having, traveled through that story with the characters.
Now, I probably asked you for tips, writing tips, back in 2019 when I first interviewed. And so while I'm happy for you to give me some more, one thing that I did wonder was, are there things that you know about yourself now as a writer that you have come to understand better now that you've published so many books?
I'd like to say that, I just have great insight into my process and I'm really comfortable and confident, but I'm afraid the answer is no. I suppose I know I've done it before. So if I get to that, 20,000, 30,000 words, and the other, rest of it's actually, this gaping abyss in front of me, I have done it before. I do know that there comes a certain point in the book, and actually the one I've just to be ready to submit soon, it came later than usual, and that was a bit scary. But then it's just a point where I really know these characters, and I'm really confident that they are really going to be, that's going to work. That's going to really work. And I just have to finish the story. So it's not that they're madly in love at all, but I think that I know that character, those two are going to really work together. And so then sometimes it is a matter of working through the rest of the plot and so on to get them there. So, I suppose trusting myself a little bit more. But I think it's always, isn't it? It's always a step into the unknown when you're actually writing a story. Just to keep going as well. And I know we all have different processes as writers, and I still do it to this day. And I give this advice to many, many aspiring writers. If you think, okay, I can't write today because I don't know what's going to happen. If you do sit down for the time you have, whether it's an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 hours, whatever it might be, and you write a page or 10 pages, you'll know by the end of that time, or it might be overnight, or it might be first thing the next morning. That might be the right direction, in which case, great, carry on. Or you might think, no, that's not working at all. And that's okay. That is one day, okay, that you've written those words and those words aren't working. But the next day you'll know exactly which way it should be going. But you have to have that awful feeling and that uncomfortable day of writing in order to get to the next day.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Now, You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but you've recently had a bit of a tree change. You know, you've moved down to the Southern Highlands from Sydney, and I wondered if that had changed your outlook on writing at all, or the kinds of things that you want to write about.
Yes, it's wonderful because the environment's there sitting right in front of me rather than reimagining it. Although, even when we live, living in Sydney, it would be, you can go for a bushwalk or go down to your local park and it's wonderful. I think it's, as people and as writers, we see beauty in the world, whether it's a solitary gum or whether it's, looking out onto, thousands of them. It's a distraction in that I sort of see, the cattle and I think, oh, they have to move paddocks. So I get up. So I have more to do in my day-to-day life in that way. And that's lovely. I'm writing a Christmas novella at the moment, actually has cattle in it. So that's really good. So I've, sort of using that inspiration. Yeah, look, I think there will be more stories as a result of where we're living now because there are many more events. And it'll be interesting to see actually, how it might change the way I tell stories. But it all starts with the characters for me and with things that I want to find out about. And I don't imagine that will ever change. Hopefully I will learn more about, land management and livestock and all those sorts of things, which is something that I've actually spoken to lots of, my last book, Sunshine Through the Rain, involved a veterinary surgeon. And so there was a lot of research in pain management in livestock animals because that's the reality that we have livestock animals. Yeah, I'm really kind of fascinated in that area and also in the sort of regenerative agriculture and the way that we can actually manage our land. So that's bound to inspire me as well.
And Pen, before we move on to other things, if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from the Summerfield Saddler, what would that be?
Yeah, I guess the two very different characters. I mean, I think in that way it's really that probably even the most different characters that I might have created as far as their backgrounds and so on. But how that can work, how you can work through difficulties. Also, I guess it does again come back to Tenterfield Saddler and the grandfather who sat on the veranda. Again, I'll repeat, Gordon Henry was just like it was kind of like the centre of the compass sort of in that story, his relationship with his granddaughter and ultimately his relationship with Kit Thorson. And he was just one of those sort of men. And I think we all know them if we've been lucky enough to come across them with a really good heart. He loves his town, he loves his family and nothing's going to move him from that. And he's not impressed by wealth or other things. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of affirming to think, yeah, there are really good people out there. I really enjoyed writing him as a character, and hopefully that comes through in the writing as well.
So what's next, Pen? You just talked about a book that you're on the cusp of submitting. Is there anything you can tell us about that novel?
That novel is called Out of the Blue, and it will be out, it might be out till early 2026. Yeah, so Out of the Blue, main character is an ornithologist. So she's water birds, things like that. That's her specialty. But her expertise and skills are needed in a sub-Antarctic island. And so she actually ends up going halfway to Antarctica anyway. And she works there with a man who is an Air Force pilot. So I've actually had to do lots of research. Planes. He's a Norwegian. He's actually Kit Thorson's brother. So yeah, look, and I think it's kind of, I'm pretty happy with it actually. I'm really happy with the relationship between those two characters. It's a very different book, very much standalone. All of my books are. But yeah, I love going back to Antarctica. Not in my mind, I haven't been there in reality, but things like the penguins and the petrels and the albatross and the bird research was amazing. And the character in that book also has a fear of flying as a result of something that's happened in her childhood. And of course, then the romantic hero is a pilot. And so flight is his thing. So there's different ways of looking at flight and all sorts of things. So yeah, I'm quite excited about that. So I have to do another big reread of that in March and then I'll submit it. And then I'm writing another Christmas novella. So that's for the last 3 years. We've had a Christmas novella published in an anthology by HarperCollins. This one's a country practice Christmas. So the 4 authors involved, we're writing stories involving country practices.
Will Kit and Mac end up making an appearance in that book, I wonder?
Well, usually I have to. That's the tricky thing because I've got actually my Christmas novella is set in Summerfield. It's actually Claudine the librarian pops up in that story quite a few years earlier, actually. Yeah. So, but then I kind of have to push those characters aside. They've had their story. They're off doing their thing. Yeah, so we focuses on the new characters. But it's been quite nice in the novella, in a small way, going back to Summerfield because, certain things have happened. So a year has passed, and that's been really nice as far as the town goes.
Pen, I've just loved chatting with you, all things Summerfield Saddler and writing. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine, for having me on your wonderful podcast.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.